Hello, it's time to begin. So we're going to get started with the post-flood world. So we just finished with the flood and all the changes that had occurred, or it caused. Now, the time span we're going to be focusing on today would be occurring between Genesis 9 and Genesis 50. But the Bible really doesn't tell us a lot about these effects, about what the world was looking like at this time. One of the key verses that it does say, though, is Genesis 13, 10 through 12. And Lot looked out and saw the whole plain of the Jordan, all the way to Zor, which was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose the whole plain of the Jordan for himself, and set out toward the east. And Abram and Lot parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, but Lot settled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent toward Sodom. This is very interesting that it's described this way, because today that is the land of the Dead Sea. It's dead. You can see from satellite imagery there's not a lot growing there, and the water ain't that great. So it doesn't really match how the Bible describes it, but it does match how it looked at the time. So we're going to be looking at the time span of 2300-ish BC to about 1600-ish BC. So from Noah's time to Joseph's time. Now, again, there's some issues in there, because whenever you're doing chronology, you're going to be off by a few years. You can't be certain on that, but close to this approximate timeline. And first, we're going to focus on the Bible lands, the lands that are described in the Bible, as well as some other equatorial or just unique places. And then we'll get into the whole global view. So the flood ended with a few things occurring. We have mountains, rivers, plains, and coastlines all being formed. The oceans would have been very warm, averaging about 68 degrees warmer. The life would have been decimated, only a handful of organisms per kind, and those all located around the Mount Ararat region. And there still would have been quite a few catastrophes going on: volcanoes, earthquakes, and many other minor floods. Now, all this warm ocean water would mean that we have abundant moisture. And the ocean water would have been warm because of all that resurfacing of the ocean crust. That would have been very warm. It cooled down, and so we got the floodwaters receding, but all that heat would have went into the water. And so we would have had about 7 times more evaporation from this water than what we see today, meaning we have about 4 to 8 times as much precipitation. And the warm ocean water would have spread on land. All the lowlands and coastal lands would have been much warmer as a result, especially in the winter, meaning their winters would have been much milder, even all the way up to the North Pole and the South Pole. So Antarctica would have been relatively hospitable at this time. And because of all this rainfall and the plant life having free reign, we'd have had a lot of, well, so I didn't realize there was a pun, sorry for that. We would have a lot of forests at this area. And so the earth would have been covered with forests, and even the deserts that we have today wouldn't have been there. We have a lot of deserts around the 30 degrees latitude north and south today. This is because we have a 3-cell Hadley system. At 30 degrees latitude, we have the air coming back down, making it very, very dry. So just after the flood, we would have had many, many giant lakes and wetlands. You can see here what the Sahara Desert would have looked like. And we know that these lakes were there based upon the sediments and the shorelines. And these shorelines are very, very sharp. They're not really eroded at all. Even in the U.S., this Great Salt Lake is now about 12 feet deep on average. Before, at this time, it's called Lake Bonneville in the sedimentary record, that it was 800 feet deep. And this is right now post-flood, about that time, about that depth. Many other lakes. In Death Valley, there would have been Lake Manly that was about 600 feet deep. It would have been a water world. And the uniformitarian, the evolutionary models have a hard time getting all this water on the land. An even harder time getting all the water for the glaciers and the ice sheets that we'll go over a bit later. With all of this rain, these lakes that were formed by the flood waters being caught on land would have just grew even further. Lake Bonneville over Salt Lake grew about 300 to 400 feet. It seems to have overtopped Red Rock Pass, cutting that down by about 350 feet and causing a flood for 8 weeks along the Snake River there. The same occurred in Africa, Australia, the Dead Sea region, the Sahara Desert, and Saudi Arabia. We can see evidence of lakes, big rivers, aquatic animals, and even artwork of people depicting this kind of aquatic, wet environments. In the Sahara Desert, we not only have elephants, giraffes, buffaloes, antelopes, and rhinos, all that we see in the African Serengeti, but we also have amphibians, hippos, crocodiles, fish, and clams, and other aquatic organisms in the Sahara Desert at this time. Even until the 20th century, the 1900s, there was dwarf crocodiles that lived in very isolated lakes or pools in the Sahara. And on satellite imagery, we can see old drainage networks in the eastern Sahara, large freshwater lakes and canals the size of the Nile River Valley. Today, this area only receives about only receives rain about once every 30 to 50 years. And we see many human artifacts, fish hooks and harpoons, artwork all in this area as well. But all these lakes eventually overflowed and flooded. You can see here another lake. This would have been a glacial lake, so caused by glacial melting, and then that later flooded. There have been many, many floods like these for hundreds of years after the Great Flood. And each of these would have carved their own little canyons. And that's why we can assume that all canyons, all big-ish things being carved by the flood. Now the really big ones, the ones that are mini state-wise, size-wise, we can be sure of that. But the ones that are state-size or smaller, we can't be assured that they were caused by the flood or a smaller post-flood flood. Even the Mississippi River is in a valley that is underfit, meaning that the river could not have formed it. It would have taken a lot more water to do all that. And this is one such thing that could have caused that. But let's focus on the Ice Age. We talked about how wet this world was, and that matches what the Bible describes the biblical lands as being: much more wet, much more vibrant, much more better for life as far as having all that food and grazing land. But what is an Ice Age? We're told that an Ice Age occurred, and in short, it's a great increase in snow and ice. From what we can tell, there seems to be about a 30% coverage of ice in the Earth's Ice Age. Now, this theory started in about the 1840s and wasn't readily accepted. They didn't like it. Uniformitarians like uniformity. This wasn't occurring today, so they didn't like it, but there was a lot of evidence, and so they had to accept it. But how do we get an Ice Age? Well, you have to have cool summers with an average temperature below or around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. You have to have warm winters, meaning below freezing still, but enough warmth that you get a lot of precipitation. And you have to have the same pattern year after year after year. So basically, there wouldn't be a lot of differences between summer and winter. The seasons wouldn't really be that noticeable. And this is very difficult to explain with the evolutionary uniformitarian model. Even after 200 years or so, it's still a mystery to them. And we know there was an Ice Age because of such things as moraines, erratic boulders, glacial lakes, and ice cores. Fossils also suggest this, and the biblical model of the Ice Age answers many mysteries that the secular model still has, including how the Ice Age came to be. Now, moraines, they're basically a hill of dirt, a till. The glacier or ice sheet was moving, and as it moved the earth. And so we have terminal or end moraines, which is where the glacier ended basically, lateral, and then ground underneath the glacier. And these, again, are all very fresh. So that means they occurred relatively recently. Now here are some pictures of some moraines. We know that these are moraines because we see glaciers today causing similar kind of sites, similar kind of evidences. You can see some ground moraines underneath the glacier, or the glacier would have been over top this, lateral moraines, end moraines, and even the scratches along bedrock. All this points to there being a giant glacier or ice sheet in certain regions. You can even see a picture here of at least 3 of these. If you got underneath the lake, you'd probably see some of the ground moraines. But this is Lake Wallowa. This is a lake in northeast Oregon. And we also have erratic boulders. Some of these are huge, 90 tons or so, and they don't match the rock that they're around. Basically, these have all been moved. We can tell by the scratches on the rocks, as well as the rocks around them, the ground around them, that these were all moved. And again, we're seeing these with today's glaciers. Now, since the 1890s, most of the major glaciers in the world are decreasing in size. There's a few exceptions, but most are. Global warming is a real event, though it does not seem to be caused by man. And a good portion of the catastrophic global warming that is touted today is because of the secular view of the Ice Age. And so with all this, we know that there was an Ice Age. And we're going to go further into the biblical model of how to explain all this. And as far as having the least assumptions and the best explanations, it is the better model. So here are today's glaciers and ice sheets. You can see, ironically, Greenland being covered with ice, as well as Antarctica and a few mountain peaks and such. Here's what it would look like at the peak of the Ice Age. Most of North America, pretty much all of Canada, as well as a good portion of Europe, Russia, and so on, all covered with ice. North America especially will focus on this because it is unique in the fact that man and animals had to come through that little corridor between the east and western ice sheets. And that is a great mystery for an Ice Age model, because there are many driftless areas, meaning areas where the glaciers didn't go. Now, for that corridor, eventually they covered it, but other areas, they never covered it. And that is a big question, because for the secular model, you'd expect to have ice everywhere. But we never had ice over a good part of Alaska, if you can see that. A good part of the areas that should have, according to the secular model, have ice, didn't. And it makes sense with the biblical model, and we'll go into that here in a bit. But first, let's talk about some of the animals, because I like animals. We're going to focus on this for a second. We have, in these Ice Age sediments, something called disharmonious association, meaning we have a strange mixture of cold-adapted and warm-adapted animals. And this is a very big mystery for the secular model, because their Ice Age would be very, very dry and even more cold. Basically, it just doesn't allow for a lot of these cold-adapted animals, let alone the warm-adapted animals, to be where they are found. In England, we have records of woolly mammoths, rhinos, muskox, reindeer, all these cold-adapted animals. But we also have hippos and cave lions. These cold-adapted animals. Let me step back. These cold-adapted animals. Thank you. Now, switch it around. I'm sorry. So we have the cold-adapted animals like the woolly mammoth, and then the warm-adapted animals like the hippo and the cave lion. And so that doesn't make sense, because today even hippos cannot survive in England. The summers are fine, but the winters are too cold. They can only survive in zoos with man's intervention. Yet we have evidence of them living in England at a time where, according to the secular model, things would have been even colder all the time. And it doesn't make sense. But the biblical model, with milder winters and cool summers, so it would have been warmer than today's winters. But the summers would have been cooler than today's summers, so they would have been able to survive at this time. The secular explanation is that seasonal migration occurred. But a lot of these animals, and even the plants, can't really do that. Hippos can't migrate very far, small animals can't do that, and plants definitely can't migrate. Some try to say there was increased climate tolerance. Now, for some of these animals that we don't really have a good understanding of what they existed in, other than the fossil record, you can make arguments for that. But animals with known modern counterparts like hippos, it's very hard to make that argument since all the data is pointing to the contrary. Some have tried to say that there's mixing of glacial and interglacial deposits, and an interglacial is the time between ice ages. We are today in an interglacial according to the evolutionary model, meaning that we're expecting an ice age sometime in the not too distant future, just a few thousand years or less. And so that is one of the reasons why there is that catastrophic climate change fear going around right now, is because they are expecting another ice age, or at least they were a few decades ago, and then it changed to global warming. But all of this doesn't fit. We can't have mixing of all these sediments occurring all over. It's just too common of an event, and there's not really any evidence of that in the sediments themselves. Another big problem is the mass extinction. At the end of the Ice Age, when things were supposedly warming up, we had an extinction of both warm and cold adapted animals. Now, these animals, according to the evolutionary model, existed through all the other ice ages, or at least a good portion of the other ice ages. Didn't die off. In fact, we don't have any other mass extinctions at any of the other supposed ice ages according to the evolutionary model. And so we have these animals dying out everywhere, not only in the north, but also in the south. You can see a map there of the mass extinction of the mammoths. In North America, we have 135 species and 33 genuses of large mammals. 70% of the mammals weighing over 100 pounds died. A number of birds, 75% of all large animals died in North America. Australia, 90%, including large versions of the kangaroos and wombats, creatures that survive there today. Over the entire world, 167 genuses of large mammals greater than 100 pounds died. You can see there the percentages of large species that died in all these continents. On average, about 2/3 of known large animals were killed off at this time, fully extinct.
So where's some of this data coming from?
Basically the fossil record. So we're seeing fossils in known glacial sediments. So sediments that are too small to be from the Great Flood, and sediments that go hand in hand with being formed by glaciers. Some of these floods would have formed sediments that we can find these fossils in, the glacier runoffs and stuff like that. A good portion of the mammoths are found in the permafrost, which is a big question for the secular model, but the biblical model makes a bit more sense, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. I hope that answered your question. And there probably will be a lot of questions on this lecture because this is new to most people. We're not taught this in school, we're not taught this in science class. A lot of this stuff the evidence is there, but we're not taught this explanation of it. And so I'm going to go over things multiple times. So if you have a question, please send it in, give me a text, give me a holler, because a lot of this stuff was new to me when I went through and studied it. Now, to explain all these deaths, all these extinction events, the secular model tries to explain it with a climate change or an overchill hypothesis. Basically, that it just got too cold and all these things died. But again, these animals supposedly survived previous glacials and interglacial periods. The ice sheets were disappearing at this time. And the climate was warming, which should make things better for them. More food, more grazing, all that. Also, the animals could have migrated because the secular model has this happening over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, a very long time. And these animals should have signs of starvation or other climate-induced trauma, yet there's very little of this. And we would expect more evidence of death in the north, but what we're seeing is that 60% of these extinctions occurred in the south. So they also have the overhunting hypothesis, that man killed off most of these large animals, because we are seeing the first evidence of man in the fossil record at this time, besides what we discussed with the flood. But now, these are the Clovis spear points, the first culture that existed in North America that we're aware of. Now, man would have to cover an extremely large area. You saw the map that I showed of the mammoth extinction area. And man mainly had these spear points, or other similar weapons. They've done tests with modern elephant skin at zoos where the elephant was already dead, and they tried to pierce it. It wasn't easy. In fact, most of the time they didn't. And mammoths would have had a few inches of fur covering this skin, making it even harder for spear points to pierce. Now, we do have remnants of some of these mammal bones, these mammoth fossils, that have spear points in them and stuff like that. So they did kill some, but it's very hard to imagine how they killed most or all of these fossils, all these animals. For one, man depended on food for hunting. There would have been a lot of people hunting to get all this food or need all this food. A lot of the mammoth remains are untouched, even the tusks. The African peoples today, for centuries, for millennia, existed with elephants, and there was very few extinctions there. And a number of other reasons. And so it doesn't really make sense. Neither one of these explanations fits why all these creatures died at the end of the Ice Age. Now we're going to go a little bit more in depth with the biblical Ice Age model. So let's back up a bit. So when Noah stepped out of the ark, we would have had cooler summers. This is because of all that volcanic ash and gas that was spewed out from those eruptions during the flood that we mentioned. The oceans would have been extremely warm. In fact, you could have swam in the Arctic Ocean. It would have been warm enough for you to do that. And all this would have created warmer winter temperatures, especially on the lowlands and coastlines, and greater precipitations overall. There have been many lakes covering the continents, as I showed, And these would have further promoted precipitation. And so we'd have had a vastly changing climate system. First, the volcanic gases. These would have acted as an anti-greenhouse gas. Think of a nuclear winter scenario, basically. These would have reflected sunlight back into space while still allowing for the infrared heat to escape the Earth. Now, Mount St. Helens is one of the best known large eruptions in modern history. The volcanic ash lasted for 2 days, but as I showed you previously, it was extremely small in comparison to some of the flood and post-flood eruptions. In 1815, there was an eruption in Indonesia. This is the largest known eruption in modern history. That caused a year without a summer in 1816, where there was heavy snowfall in June, and frost caused crop failures in July and August. Now, these large eruptions just after the flood could cause an entire hemisphere to reduce by temperatures of 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit for a few years. Just a single eruption. And there have been many eruptions occurring for centuries after the flood, as the vertical and horizontal plate tectonics began to slow down more to the modern rate. Now, this would have been happening all over the world. In the western US alone, there are 68 different ash falls, most of these coinciding with the Ice Age. So this was occurring ever since then, but most of them occurring during the Ice Age. Same for New Zealand, and these patterns would have been basically random. So overall, we would have seen a decrease, but some years would have been cooler or hotter than others depending on the eruptions that occurred just previously. And they would have mainly affected the summer temps, because the sun wouldn't get in for the summer temps as well, and it would cause them to overall be lower. Now, this would have lasted for a few centuries at least, but the oceans would have played a greater effect, especially on the Ice Age. Now, we can see evidence not only from flood models, but also in the fossil record that the ocean temps rose 68 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see this in some shells. And this would have all caused milder winters because the warm ocean heat would have spread inland. Now, it still would have been below freezing, but warmer than today, especially in the northern and southern hemisphere, or the extreme northern and southern hemispheres. Very little seasonal contrast. Now, eventually, these temps would decrease to modern temperatures as the ocean waters cooled from all the evaporation. Another thing about the ocean waters is they would have continued to recede after the flood. So the initial recession of the flood is from the crust, the ocean crust basically dropping as it cooled significantly. It would have continued to do that, but at a slower rate until it got to about today's level. But all that evaporation of the ocean waters, because they're so warm, would have caused them to recede further. And we've had a lot of water caught on land. Remember all these lakes, hundreds of feet deep lakes all over the continents. We also had all those ice sheets, and these were a few thousand feet thick. These were very thick ice sheets. All that would have stored a lot of water from the oceans on the land, allowing for a lot of the land bridges that you probably heard of, especially like the Bering Strait, but there have also been them along Indonesia leading down to Australia. And a lot of the animals would have made use of these as far as spreading out, and a lot of humans probably did as well. But all this, the ocean heat, would have led to increased precipitation. There is one scientist, Dr. Larry Varderman, that modeled 4 to 8 times as much precipitation in the ice cap areas. In some areas, that would mean 100 times the current precipitation rate. So these are incredibly high for certain areas, but overall about 48 times. This would have caused a lot of these lakes to grow and then further flood, as we discussed. But we've also have changing climate. So today we have a 3 Hadley cell system. Every 30 degrees we have a circulation area. And this is part of the reason why we have the deserts where we have deserts today. It's because the air comes down, it's dry, and it dries out those areas like Mexico, the Sahara, etc. Now, this would have been different just pre-flood, and post-flood, just post-flood. Just post-flood, it's expected that we had a 2 Hadley cell system. But this would have turned into a 3 Hadley cell system because of all these great climate changes going on. The warm oceans, volcanic eruptions, all that creating different air circulation patterns. And this changing from a 2 to 3 Hadley cell system would have affected the ice age formation. You can see there how it starts with the polar, North Pole, the same thing would be happening in the South Pole. But as it comes down, it brought cold air down with it, allowing for a greater cooling effect and a greater retention of all this snow and ice. Now, I basically said that. All right. We've also had hypercanes. Today we have hurricanes, like you can see there, an image of Hurricane Irma. A hypercane is dramatically larger. Now, these would have been large and persistent. A normal hurricane lasts for a few weeks. These could have lasted for not only a few years, but a few centuries even. These could have lasted for a few hundred years. There are two main places where we expect to have found them, the Hudson Bay and the Antarctic region. And these would have basically vacuumed off the heat from the oceans, acting as a big vacuum cleaner, pulling the heat off and sending it into space. Very similar to the storm that we see on Jupiter that's existed for the last 300 years. Overall, things would have started with warm oceans and all that volcanic gas. But things would have slowed down, getting to about 500 years being the point of glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age. And then 200 years after that, the ice would have melted relatively quickly. The oceans went from being about 86 degrees Fahrenheit to now where they are. And so things would have changed dramatically over the course of just a few centuries. And this would have made it sometimes very good with all the lush, wet environments, but also very bad because of all the catastrophic changes occurring. So, a summary of the overall events. We have the Earth covered by volumes of ash and gas spewed out into the atmosphere, cooling the summer temperatures. We have the oceans being extremely warm, warming the winter temperatures and promoting precipitation, as well as all those lakes covered in land. This causing the Ice Age. Now we're going to get a little bit more in detail. So the warm oceans basically causing all this, remember, warm enough to swim in the Arctic and the Antarctic oceans as well. We would have had sea ice. So all those oceans would have further promoted precipitation because evaporation would have been coming from them. And they'd also warm the areas around them. And so we have 7 times faster evaporation and far more precipitation. But we would still had snow. In a lot of areas there would have been rain, but we would still been cold enough for snow, especially in the winter, northern, and extreme southern environments. And once you get snow forming, it's going to further cool the environment. Basically, once you get a good snow coverage, it can cool the temperature about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, total, based upon 2 of the main storm tracks, it's estimated that there's about 2,200 feet of ice deposited. That would mean about 10 times that in snow, and further 500 feet of ice deposited by other storm tracks. Now, the lowlands would have been delayed for a time, like that the passageway from Alaska into the USA that would have been there in the middle of the Ice Age. That would have stayed relatively ice-free, allowing a lot of the animals to migrate in. Eventually, that would have glaciated up. And so this would explain also the disharmonious association, because we see these animals not only existing in the same area. If you have a lowland near a mountainous region, you're going to have the warm and the cold adapted animals. But if you have the coast and the lowlands in Alaska, you're going to have some warm adapted animals there. But when you have the glaciers towards the south, towards near where we are at here in Indiana, we'd have had more cold adapted animals. They shouldn't be surviving there today, nor should the warm adapted animals be surviving in Alaska today. But that would make sense with the biblical model. And so we'd have had all these areas covered with ice and a great amount of it. But not all. We'd have these driftless areas. And just keep going over these, hoping that, that I can say it's enough to you guys remember it. Now, the deserts would have been wet at this time. I just want to reiterate that point as well. All these heavy precipitation belts would have caused monsoons and other great climatic features in this area. So like the Sahara Desert being more of a temperate grassland or even an aquatic area. And so the flood, while being responsible for a lot of these Great Lakes, they would have been made greater by the rain. All right, already covered that. Now, getting a glacier would have occurred after you get some snow going. It's going to get colder there, and the summer temps would have been low enough that it doesn't melt away. So that means the intensity of the sunshine, if it was freezing or slightly above freezing, it would have melted a good portion of it. So that either means we needed enough snow that 32 degrees Fahrenheit couldn't melt it all, or that we had slightly lower temperatures. Now, based upon what we see today, 20 degrees Fahrenheit is a good guess on that. So it could have been 20 degrees Fahrenheit in some of these northern environments in the middle of summer, which is colder than some of the summers today, but still perfect living weather for a lot of these cold adapted animals. Remember, this is for the glacier developing areas, not the lowlands.
So, John, as you're talking, I'm trying to build a mental picture of this, and we kind of have this generic idea: the poles are cold, the equator's warm, and it graduates in between. But what you're saying is a lot more like the jet stream or something like that, where you have a lot of warm weather brought into a certain location where it really shouldn't be because it's too far north.
Exactly.
And so wherever these Hadley cells are, is it where they're bringing air down? It's cold.
Nope. So the Hadley cells is just a minor thing.
Okay.
It would be a part of it, by no means the greater part. The greater part would have been the hot oceans. So whenever you had the lowlands allowing this warm ocean air to get into easier, it would have remained warmer in those areas. It would not have allowed glaciers to form, and this is why we don't see as many glaciers developing in Alaska, where today we'd expect it to be.
Because it's low.
Exactly. But the mountainous regions like the Rocky Mountains, whatever you call them in Canada and such like that, they would have been very much covered with ice, as well as the higher areas in eastern Canada.
Okay, so your higher elevations are going to be developing glaciers on a pretty
large scale.
Large scale, and then those are going to come down the mountains into the lower areas.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And as the oceans cool off, that's going to facilitate that. So it all depends on the volcanic gas, making the summers to where they aren't warm enough so that the glaciers continue to grow,
Okay.
as well as
volcanic gas cools the atmosphere. How?
blocking the sun.
Blocking the sun with the ash.
Yep.
Okay.
And then the oceans warming the winters enough for precipitation, as well as basically keeping it to where a lot of animals could still survive in that location. So snow in the winter, snow survives the summer, year after year.
If I'm jumping ahead, just tell me.
You're fine.
The mass extinctions seem to be from glacier flow?
Nope.
Okay, all right. But we're
Some died from
Sure.
the glacier melting, but the glaciers would have advanced while much faster than the secular model, still slow enough to avoid.
Okay, okay.
Think of a walking wall, just a few feet a day.
Yeah.
Sometimes faster than that, but by no means would these be coming at you at 22 miles per hour or anything.
So the Ice Age movie overdid that just a little.
Just a little bit, yeah. Yeah.
And did we get to what those extinctions are from yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah. Patience, young grass.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So we have a lot of snow forming. And this snow is going to turn to ice by one of two methods. Either by the partial summer melting, or snow getting to 200 feet deep and just compacting into ice. And 1 inch of ice is equal to 10 inches of snow. So we had a lot of snow to get these thousands of feet of ice. Now, these lowlands would not have had glaciers on them, at least for a time, if not completely. And this is a big problem, again, with the uniformitarian model. I just want to reiterate that, because the flood model answers a lot of these mysteries and still has good answers for everything else that the secular model tends to explain. So overall, it's a better model. And so a lot of these animals would have migrated into the Americas via this little land gap, this ice gap between the two great glaciers. And so eventually that would have closed near the peak of the Ice Age. And so as the oceans cool down, we get less evaporation. That means things are going to get drier. And that's going to change the climate from being very foresty, with the forest being pretty much everywhere, to more of a grassland. And we can even see this effect in the fossils. We can see horses changing their teeth, going from a more foraging animal where they can get leaves and stuff like that from trees, to a more grass-eating animal, by their teeth changing to have something called hypsodont in them. And this occurred in many different areas, which is a big question for the evolutionary model. How did these things pop out all over the place all at once and so quickly? It makes perfect sense with the biblical model. The environment changes the epigenetic expression, allowing for the genes that God already put in there to come out because the animal needed them at that time. We'll go a little bit more into that over the next few lessons as we focus more on the animals, not so much the climate. This also would solve the productivity paradox, all the forest turning to grasslands. That would have given all of these animals that we have in the fossil record plenty of food to eat. this is another problem with the secular model, because today in Alaska and Siberia and all these cold places, they have bogs that don't really produce a lot of vegetation. And they only produce them when it gets warm enough to melt the permafrost to form these bogs. But remember, we have the unglaciated lowlands turning into a vast grassland. And this would have been called the Mammoth Steppe, or we call it that today, I should say. It would have been very similar to the Serengeti in Africa, as well with having those large animals. A semi-arid plain with abundant grass and few trees. And so we'd have a warmer environment because of the ocean heat allowing for all these things to occur at these extreme north latitudes, which again is a very big question for the secular Ice Age model. And so how long did it take to reach maximum glaciation? We'll go a little bit into how we got to that 500 number. The uniformitarian model says it takes 100,000 years to get that, to go through an Ice Age cycle. Now, for the biblical model, to estimate that length depends on how long it would take for the warm oceans to cool after the flood. And by using a number of equations, you can get anywhere from 170 years to about 10 times that, 1,700 years. But the average, the most likely number, would be about 500. And so this would have been one of the main things affecting the rate of glaciation. And the volcanic dust and gas would have been probably similar to this. So when the volcanism slows down, the summers are going to get hotter. As the summers get hotter, this would have been mainly in the tropics that would have occurred very quickly because it doesn't have any of the ice in the tropics. This heating up of the summers would have occurred slower at the northern hemispheres, the northern latitudes, because of all that ice, but it still would have occurred. And so as it gets hotter, it's going to start melting a bit more of this ice and snow each summer. So it's going to slow down and eventually turn the glacier from forming into receding. And at the same time, the oceans are cooling. So as we get some melting of these glaciers, all this fresh glacier runoff is going to go onto the oceans. And salt and fresh water don't mix right away. And so with the oceans being colder, it's going to refreeze. And this is how we get a lot of the sea ice that we have today. And this would have further made the winters drier because we have less evaporation, but we also have basically the ocean being blocked off from the land, making some areas colder since we don't have that heat from the ocean coming in because we have a sheet of ice blocking it. And so we have this basically, once it starts, running off. It's going to be a chain reaction, a positive feedback cycle that's going to further create more sea ice. And all this melting of glaciers is going to form basically glacier lakes and then eventually glacier flooding, like the Lake Missoula flood that I mentioned previously. So this flood has been rejected for over 40 years because it was deemed too biblical by the secular scientists. Eventually they finally had to accept it, but they have a distinct dislike of anything that's remotely biblical, though obviously this wasn't the flood the Bible's talking about. But this was just one of many floods that occurred at this time. So we go from these hot oceans and volcanic eruptions, leading us to basically warm winters with a lot of snow forming and cool summers with not much snow melting. Now, with the oceans becoming colder and less volcanism and the sea ice covering some of the oceans, that means less evaporation, meaning we're going to have drier atmospheres. The winters are going to further become colder because we don't have the warm oceans heating them. We also have ice forming on the northern and extreme northern and southern latitudes. And we're also going to have the ice melting a little bit further south and even at the north a little bit. But that's going to be slowly increasing. And so we have all this occurring as the Ice Age starts to wane. So drier, less snow, less rain, and more extremes of temperature. Colder winters, warmer summers. And we're about the 500-year mark at this time when these things start to really get going. And when you have dry areas as well as extremes in temperature, you're going to get death of a lot of plants. And when you have all these extreme temperatures as far as the extreme northern latitudes and the more equatorial latitudes being in such different extremes, remember we have all this ice to the north making it a bit colder, while all the normal climate effects will be still happening in the tropics. that means we're going to have a lot of strong winds, because all this changes in heat are going to get everything moving that much faster. And then when you have all these dead plants, giving a lot of good soil being shown to the air, without any roots holding together, you're going to get basically a gigantic dust bowl. And so that is what causes a lot of this mineral-rich louse. It's called something different in Alaska versus Siberia, but basically the same thing is found all across the north here. And so that's going to get all these gigantic dust storms. And so we got this drought killing off a lot of the southern giant animals, because when you have drought, you have a lot of the plant life dying. Because remember, not as much evaporation. These plants, these environments were used to a lot of heavy rainfall, a lot of precipitation. And that's what we see in the Bible. We see a lot of droughts and famines mentioned in Abraham's time and beyond. We see this occurring then, and this is likely why Abraham is about this time in the timeline. So it seems to match up with what we're seeing in the biblical record. But all this in the northern hemisphere especially would have caused a lot of these gigantic dust storms. And this would have been even so bad that it would have buried a lot of these giant animals, these mammoths. But the giant animals even died in the south because of all this drought. It takes a lot more food, a lot more water to sustain a large animal than a small animal. And that's why all these animals that seem to have died were the biggest. Now, a few exceptions are elk, deer, and bison. And maybe these survive because they're more able to vary their habitat. They can survive in a more mountainous terrain and other such things. But overall, this would have killed about 400 mammal families. And remember, family is, as far as we're aware for the general rule, the biblical kind. Meaning we have a lot of death of mammal kinds at this time due to this dramatic climate change. And all this is very perplexing because their model doesn't allow for any of these dramatic changes. These changes would have occurred very, very slowly over the course of, again, thousands of years, giving plenty of time for animals to adapt or move. And so all this cold winters, killing off plants, the dry winters and summers, causing droughts, the ice sheets melting and causing occasional superfloods, the permafrost forming as all this blown about silt begins to freeze. And that's why we find a lot of these mammoths in the permafrost. It's a very big question. How did all these animals get buried in solid ice? Now, some of them from like rock slides and stuff like that, but 50 million? There's too many of them for that to be the case on all of them. Yet with all these Dust Bowl kind of events going on, it would make sense that a lot of the things were covered up. And that's why we find a lot of these animals buried in permafrost, buried in solid ice basically, because as the sand covers them, they die, and then water comes in and freezes at its own leisure. And so gigantic dust storms, droughts, fires, and the carnivores initially would survive relatively well, feasting, but as soon as a lot of these large animals died off and there were no more, they would then follow suit. So we not only have the large large herbivores dying, we have the large carnivores dying as well. And that's why this mass extinction really should be called an extinction of the massive. So far we got the cool summers and warm winters leading into the wet deserts and the ice age, leaving very little difference in the seasons other than wet and dry basically at the initial point, just post-flood. Some areas would have developed ice very quickly, covering large swaths of the continents. And eventually the oceans would have lowered, allowing land bridges to form and animals to migrate. Now, after a while, the oceans would have cooled and we would have started to get some melting of the ice sheets. The cooling oceans would have led to less evaporation, less precipitation, leading to more droughts, more famines, and in some cases, the severe Dust Bowl kind of situations and death of a lot of these massive animals. Now, this is a lot of information, a lot of new information. So use the resources. I've uploaded these slides to the folder on the Google Drive. If you don't have access to that, let me know. But there's a lot of good books, a lot of things that you can watch to just reiterate these talking points. And they have a lot more evidence to go through. A lot more of the fossils, a lot more of the geology evidence. And it's really quite interesting how well this fits together. And I initially had a lesson, or a second part of this lesson, going over the number of ice ages, the timing, and basically taking apart the secular model a lot more detail. But because I got so much stuff after this, we're going to skip this for now. So if you want this information, it's also on the Google Drive. But basically, it goes over how they built this Ice Age model on 2 ocean sediment cores. And then a few decades later, they changed the dating on these cores and didn't realize that that negated a good portion of their Ice Age model. And now they're kind of floundering. It also goes into that there wasn't a large number of ice ages, there's just one, and a lot of the evidence for that goes out with those 2 cores. It goes over a number of other things, especially how they tie the modern fear of catastrophic climate change to this Ice Age model. That's why back in the 80s, the big fear was another Ice Age, global freezing, cooling. Now, that all goes into that as well. But since our main focus is going to be basically on how the Bible is accurate in what it tells us with going on with the earth, and so we can trust it with the spiritual things it tells us as well, we'll postpone this for now, and if we have time later, we may go over that. But the information is there on the Google Drive. So next time, we'll be going more into the animals and man, just post-flood. So try to remember these events that we discussed today, and how that might play a role in some of the things that we see with man and animals at this time, or with the next lectures. And so try to get this all into one mindset. And go over this again. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's it. Any other questions coming in? All right.
Yeah, matter of fact.
Sure.
So, the ice would have been massive in some areas, and in other areas, non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So a good portion of Alaska would have had no ice on it.
The Dust Bowls would have been in some locations, and across massive areas, but not globally.
Yeah, so basically the Dust Bowl areas would have been a lot of the places where the glaciers were receding. So we see a lot of this evidence in like Siberia and Alaska. And that's why a lot of the sediment is so rich, because basically you had all these plants dying, a lot of these dust storms, and basically burying a lot of these not only dead plants, but also these dead animals. And then some of these locations, you get the permafrost forming after that. Now, according to the secular model, the permafrost would have been there the entire Ice Age. So it's a big mystery how you got all these Ice Age animals buried in Ice Age permafrost, because it wouldn't have melted this deep.
Yeah. It made sense as you described it, like if it freezes as it builds up, then that's why it's a permafrost that's so deep.
Yeah.
Going forward, what would we expect heating and cooling cycles to be like?
Well, that's a lot in these next slides that we're going to skip for now.
Okay.
But in short, it's due to solar changes. So there was a little ice age and a little heating spot. I don't know what they call the heating time period, but basically when the Vikings were colonizing like Iceland, it was a very warm period. And so that's why they had such good environments there, because it was warmer than what it was today. But then the solar basically events changed, and then we had a bit of a cooling. And now we're kind of warming up. That's why in like the 1800s, before a lot of the Industrial Revolution was occurring, they had a fair on the middle of the Thames, where it was frozen solid enough that they go out and have a fair out there every year. But that stopped because eventually the ice wasn't thick enough for them to have the fair without people dying. And so that all occurred well before the Industrial Revolution really got going. Now, the carbon dioxide has had an effect on the global temperatures, but a very, very low effect. And that's all in these slides.
So in my mind, and I haven't studied any of this stuff, I imagine these cycles beginning to, I don't know if the word is kind of modulate closer and closer together, where there are fewer and fewer extremes.
Not really.
Forward.
So a lot of the effects of the flood ended a few, maybe a millennia afterwards, as far as these climate changes. The tectonic effects, since they were larger, we can still see them today, but they're very, very slow in comparison to what they were. The solar effects, we don't really have any good connection to the flood or the ice age or anything like that.
So those would continue to be whatever
Potentially
they might
random.
be.
Yeah, basically they're solar flare events. So the sun has a bunch of solar flares. It's not the flares that make things warm, but it's something else that happens at the same time as the flares that we can't see as well. And so basically when we have a lot of those, it's going to get that much warmer, but it also depends upon cloud coverage and stuff like that. And so it gets very complex. But in short, the sun is at least 50%, if not more, of the perpetrator for a lot of the changes we see in climate.
But we do see
Nowadays, I should say.
Tectonics changes slowing down even today.
Yeah. So today we see the tectonics kind of going back and forth.
Okay.
I had a slide about Mount Everest and K2. They are going up but also going down. So things are still bobbing up and down for them. They're getting pretty close to equilibrium. That being said, this probably will continue for a good few hundred years or so, since these things slow down very, very slowly.